The sun was slowly sinking behind the tall city buildings as the black car drove through the gates of the Vieira mansion. The sound of tires on gravel echoed through the quiet courtyard, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The imposing cold house reflected the same golden glow of sunset from its windows, but there was no warmth in the place. Everything there was soulless beauty, lifeless luxury, a meticulously arranged setting to hide solitude. Laura Vieira observed the facade with bated breath. This was the house where she had grown up, the home she had left as a young woman, when her mother died and her father immersed himself in work. Now, years later, she returned not as the joyful daughter who had departed, but as a woman shaped by loss and silence. Her father had called her back, and even without fully understanding why, she had come, driven by a mixture of duty and longing. The atmosphere inside the house was almost sacred, as if the furniture and paintings held secrets that couldn't be spoken aloud. The air smelled of expensive flowers and suppressed fear. Servants walked with short steps, eyes lowered, following hard-learned routines. It was as if every corner whispered an uncomfortable truth, that here, appearance was more important than affection. Upstairs, the patriarch's portrait dominated the main wall. Eduardo Vieira, a respected businessman, a symbol of power and authority. The man who built an empire and sacrificed his own heart in the process. Time and illness had weakened him, but his presence still loomed large, strong, almost oppressive. And there was Patricia, the stepmother, the woman who had transformed the house into a temple of vanity, where the reflection in the mirrors was valued more than any gesture of love. Beautiful, elegant, and calculatedly sweet, she maintained the appearance of a devoted wife. But behind her clear eyes there was something hard, something that betrayed the constant vigilance of someone fearful of losing what she had gained. Laura's arrival did not go unnoticed. The news spread quickly among the employees like a wind lifting curtains and awakening memories. Many remembered the girl with the easy laugh who ran through the gardens, now replaced by a woman with a serene posture and a deep gaze. There was an unease in the air, an inevitable collision between past and present. That night, a formal dinner was prepared to mark the return. The table was impeccable, crystal, silverware, fresh flowers. But the atmosphere was one of a forced rehearsal. Eduardo tried to smile, hiding the weariness of someone living surrounded by conveniences. Patricia, at his side, observed Laura's every gesture with cool courtesy. The young woman could sense, without needing words, that her presence was disturbing. As dinner progressed at a mechanical pace, Laura felt the invisible weight of the house on her shoulders. The antique clock ticked slowly, and with each passing second she realized how much everything had changed. Her father seemed frail, his voice cracking and his eyes watering. Patricia, on the other hand, radiated a kind of quiet control, as if every glance from her was a reminder that Laura was an intruder. Later, going up to her old room, Laura walked through the hallways, which seemed narrower than before. The walls were covered with new portraits, all of Patricia, on trips, at events, at celebrations. No trace of the past, no memory of the woman who had been Laura's first wife, her mother. It was as if her existence had been carefully erased. Closing the bedroom door, Laura sat up in bed and took a deep breath. The silence was almost deafening. Outside, the wind blew against the windows, and the moon cast long shadows across the floor. The young woman knew this return wasn't a simple family reunion. There was something unspoken, something heavy in her father's gaze and reflected in Patricia's tension. In the following days, the mansion's routine followed a strange choreography. Eduardo insisted that his daughter accompany him to the company. He wanted to show her everything he had built, perhaps paving the way for a future transition. Patricia watched every move with concealed interest. She couldn't bear to see the young woman occupying spaces that, according to her, belonged only to the patriarch's wife. Laura, discreet, walked through the construction company's corridors with measured steps. Employees watched her silently, curious about the presence of the owner's daughter, who seemed to have appeared suddenly, beautiful and reserved, with a distant air. Some whispered, others looked away. The rumor hadn't started yet, but the ground was already fertile. and a spark would be all it took for the fire to spread. Weeks passed, and Laura began to notice disturbing details. Phone calls interrupted when she entered the room, suspicious glances, notes left by mistake. Patricia seemed more attentive than ever, following her husband everywhere but with a strange glint in her eyes. It was as if she sensed an invisible threat. Eduardo, weakened, showed genuine affection for his daughter. Between reports and meetings, he found time to have lunch with her, talk about the past, and remember his mother. These moments, innocent and full of tenderness, began to deeply disturb Patricia, who saw in them a kind of love she had never experienced. Jealousy, subtle and poisonous, began to infiltrate the walls of the house like a shadow. The father-daughter relationship, once merely a natural bond, became a source of surveillance. Patricia began observing more closely, listening in on conversations, questioning schedules. Small gestures, like a touch on the shoulder or a loving look, began to be interpreted through the distorted lens of insecurity. On a gray afternoon, as the rain fell lightly on the living room windows, Laura noticed the house seemed to breathe a heavy air. The servants spoke in whispers, the hallways were empty, and Patricia paced restlessly. Her father was growing increasingly tired, and his daughter followed him in silence, unaware that with every act of care, she was feeding an invisible monster, that of distrust. The mansion, once a symbol of success, now seemed like a stage about to collapse. Everything there was tense, the stepmother's gaze, the father's weariness, the silence of the servants. And at the center of it all, Laura, the daughter who only wanted a father's love, but who was beginning to be seen as an intruder, a threat, a presence disrupting the perfect order of the Vieira Empire. Outside, the sky darkened completely. The distant sound of thunder broke the silence of the night. Like an omen, the approaching storm would not be of wind or rain, but of words, lies, and misunderstandings that would change everything forever. And without realizing it, Laura took the first step towards the abyss where love would be confused with betrayal. The morning dawned gray, with dense clouds covering the sky and muffling the sunlight. Inside the Vieira mansion, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hallways, mingling with the clinking of cups and muffled voices. It was the start of another ordinary day, but there was something different in the air, a kind of silent electricity that precedes tragedy. Eduardo had woken up feeling weaker than usual. The doctor had ordered rest, but he insisted on going to work. Laura, worried, decided to accompany him. Her presence was a natural gesture of care, a reflection of the love that still united father and daughter despite the years of separation. But to Patricia's uncertain eyes, that gesture had another meaning. From her bedroom window, Patricia watched them leave together. Eduardo's daughter, elegant and discreet, seemed a mirror of what she herself had been in the past, before age, before fear, before ambition. There was something about Laura that disconcerted her, that impossible to imitate serenity, that light that effortlessly drew attention. Patricia felt her stomach tighten. An ancient, corrosive, silent feeling took hold of her, jealousy. At the construction company, the morning passed with reports, meetings, and phone calls. Laura helped her father with paperwork, reviewed documents, and accompanied him patiently and lovingly. Eduardo smiled, grateful for his daughter's presence, finding in her a comfort that not even his business success had given him. The employees, accustomed to their boss's rigidity, found this softer, more human man strange. It was in this seemingly normal scenario that fate began to weave its cruelest thread. Patricia, driven by an unhealthy need to control everything, decided to make a surprise appearance at the company. The pretext was simple, to deliver some documents. But deep down, what drove her was the fear of losing the position she had earned. The sound of Patricia's heels echoed down the main hallway as she entered the building. Eyes turned to her, as they always did. The owner's wife was a figure of commanding presence, and no one dared question her authority. But that day, something in her gaze betrayed an inner turmoil. As she approached the main room, Patricia heard soft laughter coming from inside. The harmless sound ignited something inside her. She pushed open the door before the secretary could announce her arrival. What she saw for a brief instant was an image frozen in time. Her husband embracing a young woman by the window, his face leaning tenderly over hers. It was a pure embrace, filled with paternal affection. But for Patricia, what formed in her mind was something else. Betrayal took shape, color, and smell in that exact second. The image stuck with her like an instant scar. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. Eduardo backed away slowly, surprised by his wife's sudden entrance. Laura, confused, tried to comprehend the look of shock and anger Patricia was giving her. But the judgment had already been made. Patricia didn't need explanations. The story was already made up in her head, and no truth would be able to disarm her. Without a word, she strode across the room and before everyone's eyes raised her hand. The sound of the slap cut through the air like thunder. A sharp blow, filled with hatred and shame. The impact made Laura's body tilt slightly, but she didn't react. She stood there motionless, her face burning. The silence that followed was absolute. Secretaries, assistants, managers, everyone froze. No one dared breathe. The slap echoed through the hallways like a sentence. There were no witnesses willing to defend the truth. Every glance that met was filled with shock and doubt. Within minutes, the distorted version of what had happened began to spread like smoke. The mysterious young woman who had been accompanying the company owner was, according to the whispers, a lover. Laura walked silently to the elevator, her eyes watering and her body rigid. The world seemed to spin around her, but she didn't shed a tear in front of the others. Each step she took was heavy, as if the ground wanted to swallow her. The sound of the elevator closing behind her was the cruel end of a chapter that should never have been. Patricia, for her part, remained standing in the center of the room, trying to regain control. Her hands trembled, but her face remained cool. Eduardo, shocked, didn't have time to react. His words died in his throat, choked by shame and shock. That night, the house fell silent. None of the servants dared comment on what they had seen or heard. Patricia locked herself in her room staring at the mirror, trying to convince herself she had done the right thing. Eduardo remained in his office, surrounded by papers and memories, trying to understand how the purest love he had ever known had become a source of shame. Laura, alone in the room that no longer belonged to her, sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of injustice fall upon her shoulders. Her face still burned, but what hurt most was the emptiness. A slap might touch the skin, but the real blow was to the heart, the one that didn't understand the reason, the one that only wanted to be a daughter. Outside, the rain began to fall, thick, insistent, washing the mansion's walls as if trying to erase the day's marks. But some stains never fade. Some stories are born to wound before they heal. The next day, the scandal had already spread. Veiled messages, whispers in the hallways, glances that flitted away. The boss's daughter had been mistaken for his mistress. A grotesque lie, but powerful because it was told in anger and easily believed. Patricia, silently, fueled the flame of misunderstanding. She didn't try to undo the misunderstanding. On the contrary, she let it grow as proof that she was right. Pride prevented her from seeing the truth, that what she feared wasn't a physical betrayal, but an emotional loss. Eduardo loved his daughter in a way he'd never loved anyone else. And for a woman overcome by insecurity, this was intolerable. Meanwhile, Laura disappeared from the world's view. She didn't return to the company, avoided seeing her father, and hid in the garden during her rare moments of calm. Something inside her had broken. The purity of her relationship with her father had been tarnished, and nothing seemed capable of restoring what had been lost. The house that once symbolized success was now a silent battlefield. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch her with disapproval. The curtains, once open, now remained closed, as if the sun were afraid to enter. And so, amidst silences and crooked glances, the greatest tragedy began to unfold, the slow destruction of a family through the power of a lie. The slap had only been the beginning. The real blow was yet to come, and it would be far deeper than any physical pain. The days following the scandal dragged on like a sequence of slow-motion scenes, each one more intense than the last. The sound of the slap still echoed in the minds of everyone who witnessed it, and even those who didn't seem to feel its reverberation in the air. The Vieira Construction Company, once a symbol of stability, began to breathe rumors. What had begun as a misunderstanding now took shape as a real one, fueled by whispers and hidden glances. Inside the mansion, the silence was thick, almost solid. The walls seemed to absorb the words no one dared to say. Eduardo, dejected, tried to comprehend what had happened, but shame prevented him from looking for his daughter. Patricia, on the other hand, maintained a studied calm, walking the halls with the confidence of someone who believes they are right. There was a strange glint in her eyes, a mixture of victory and fear. Laura lived in an invisible exile. Her presence in the house had become uncomfortable, almost a constant reminder of something no one wanted to face. She avoided meetings, meals, glances. Her room, once a refuge, had become a prison. The closed curtains, the stuffy air, and the distant echo of voices downstairs were all that remained. At night, she could hear the sound of Patricia's footsteps down the hallway, firm and measured, as if marking the rhythm of absolute dominion. The young woman tried to understand what had happened. She replayed every gesture, every look, searching in the past for the exact point where the truth had broken. But what she found was a labyrinth of intentions and appearances. The love she felt for her father, pure, simple, and sincere, was now tainted by suspicion. It was as if the world had decided to turn him into something dirty. While Laura sank into isolation, the company was buzzing. The scandal had become a secret topic among executives and employees. No one spoke openly, but everyone knew. A misinterpreted hug had become the center of a convenient narrative, that the aging owner had become involved with a beautiful and mysterious young woman kept under protection in the mansion. And because the lie found fertile ground in human malice, it grew unabated. Patricia watched silently. She didn't need to say anything. Her distant gaze and cold demeanor were enough to reinforce what was already believed. She had discovered the power of what was unsaid. Defenselessness was her greatest weapon. If Laura remained silent, it was because she was guilty. If she tried to explain herself, she would be seen as a liar. In either case, Patricia won. Eduardo felt the weight of disorder. The days at the office became long, the meetings tense. There was something in the air, a subtle discomfort that made him doubt even himself. His wife's words, always measured and sweet, began to seep like poison into his thoughts. She didn't accuse directly, but left suspended sentences, delicate insinuations. Little by little, doubt began to dwell between love and guilt. One afternoon, Laura left the mansion for the first time since the scandal. She walked aimlessly through the nearby streets. The city seemed different, the sound of cars distant, the people too hurried to notice a woman broken inside. She entered a small cafe and sat by the window. She watched the people move about, trying to remember what it was like to live without fear of stares. Everything about her exuded a silent sadness, that of someone who carries an invisible mark. It was there, staring at the reflection of her own face in the glass, that she realized how much she had changed. The former sparkle in her eyes had given way to a deep melancholy. The innocence that had brought her back now seemed like a cruel irony. She was no longer the loving daughter who had returned to care for her father, but the center of a scandal she had never caused. When he returned home, he found the atmosphere even more tense. Patricia had reorganized everything, the placement of the flowers, mealtimes, even the furniture arrangement. It was as if she wanted to erase any trace of Laura's presence. Eduardo remained distant, increasingly tired, surrounded by reports and worries. The house had become a cold stage, a theater where everyone pretended nothing had happened. But there was something new, a growing emptiness in Eduardo's heart. His daughter's estrangement gnawed at him, and guilt haunted him. He tried to convince himself it had all been a misunderstanding, but the shadows Patricia cast confused him. Sometimes when he caught a glimpse of Laura in the hallways, he felt a deep ache in his chest, as if the distance between them were greater than any possible explanation. Meanwhile, Patricia was beginning to lose control over herself. The venom she had spread was now poisoning her as well. The previously submissive looks of her employees became discreetly judgmental. She felt the weight of doubt in others, and to maintain control, she began to act more calculatedly. She ordered changes in the company, reorganized roles, and completely isolated Laura from her father's work environment. But Laura didn't give up trying to understand. She began to notice small details, interrupted conversations, missing documents, suspicious movements. She discovered that behind the scandal lay something bigger: irregular transactions, financial embezzlement, and manipulation involving people close to her stepmother. The lie about the alleged affair served as the perfect distraction, diverting attention from something much more serious. From that moment on, her pain began to transform into purpose. The injustice still suffocated her, but the desire to reveal the truth grew within her like a silent flame. Laura began to piece together fragments, to gather evidence, to understand that she had not simply been the victim of a mistake, she had been the target of a plot. Outside, the weather changed again. The nights grew longer, the wind grew colder, and the garden lost its luster. It was as if the nature around the house reflected the inner state of those who lived there. The flowers wilted before they could bloom, and the lake, once crystal clear, now seemed murky. Injustice, like a living shadow, had taken over everything. And while her father languished in guilt and doubt, and her stepmother sank into her own lies, Laura began to awaken to a new strength, one born of pain and the need to prove that love was not a sin. However, before she could act, something more serious was about to happen. The lie would reach proportions that would transcend the walls of the house and tarnish the family name forever. What was once just a rumor would now become headline news. And the entire world would come to see her not as a daughter, but as the woman everyone believed had destroyed a powerful man. Laura's face, reflected in the mirror that night, looked like a stranger's. Time seemed to have advanced years in just a few days. Her eyes, once full of sweetness, now held the firmness of those wronged and yet remained steadfast. She knew she couldn't run away. If fate had placed her there, it was to face it. And so, in the silence of her room, she swore to herself, not in words, but in her mind, that one day the truth would be revealed. And when that day came, the world would know the woman behind the scandal, not the alleged lover, but the daughter whose love had been mistaken for sin. The morning began differently. The sky was overcast, as if even the sun had refused to witness what was about to happen. The wind blew hard through the windows of the Vieira Construction Company, scattering leaves and documents as a harbinger of disorder. There was something in the air, an electric tension, invisible, but impossible to ignore. Laura walked the halls with firm steps. She was no longer the same dejected woman she'd been days before. Fear had given way to determination, and pain to clarity. In her hands, a folder full of evidence, and in her eyes, the courage of someone who had nothing left to lose. In the last few weeks, she had uncovered everything. The manipulations, the embezzlement, the contracts forged in the company's name, the hidden accounts held under third parties. Patricia hadn't just plotted against her. She had betrayed her own husband, embezzling money and using the scandal to cover her tracks. Every lie, every false look, was now recorded in documents that would speak louder than any defense. On the main floor, Eduardo was presiding over a board meeting. His expression was weary, his gaze distant. Patricia stood beside him, elegant as ever, dressed in sober tones, maintaining the same air of calculated serenity. When Laura entered, the air seemed to change. All eyes turned to her, some in surprise, others in discomfort. The click of her heels on the floor echoed like a challenge. She stopped in front of the desk and placed the briefcase firmly on it. The silence was absolute. "Everything that was said about me was a lie," he began, his voice firm though his heart was pounding. "And it's all here." Patricia gave a brief, almost condescending smile, but there was something in her gaze that betrayed fear. Eduardo tried to speak, but Laura continued, opening the documents one by one. She revealed suspicious bank transfers, deleted emails, and doctored reports. She showed how the accusations against her began shortly after a meeting in which she questioned irregularities in the company's projects, and how Patricia used the hug to plant the doubt that would destroy her. With each page turned, Eduardo's face grew paler. The truth emerged like a slow, painful blow. The executives exchanged stunned glances. The woman who had once been seen as a symbol of elegance and fidelity was now being unmasked before everyone. Patricia tried to react. Her voice, trembling at first, regained strength as her desperation grew. "This is a farce. An invention of a resentful girl," she said, trying to maintain her composure. But her tone betrayed her nervousness. Laura stared at her without blinking. Time seemed to stand still. "What you created was a farce, Patricia. And you," she looked at her father, "believed it." The silence was piercing. Eduardo lowered his gaze, unable to look at her. The weight of guilt crushed him. He remembered the nights he had doubted his own daughter, the words he hadn't said, the gestures he hadn't made. Each memory now cut him like a blade. Patricia tried to reach out to him, but Eduardo instinctively backed away. "Enough," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Everything I did was for you," she screamed, losing control. "For me?" he replied, raising his voice for the first time. "Or for yourself?" The executives remained motionless, unable to intervene. Patricia, feeling the ground slipping away, dropped her mask. Desperation took over. She tried to argue, but the evidence was irrefutable. Laura had gathered everything: dates, records, signatures. Each line was a sentence. When the last page was placed on the table, there was nothing left to say. Patricia, once imposing, now seemed smaller. Her gaze was lost, her body trembling. Eduardo, his face covered in silent tears, slowly turned to his daughter. Laura said nothing. Her look was enough, a mixture of pain, forgiveness, and dignity. He tried to move closer, but she took a step back, not out of anger, but out of respect for her own heart. It was too late to take back what had been said, but not to show who she really was. Patricia left the room amidst murmurs. Her perfect image had crumbled before everyone's eyes, and with it, the empire of appearances that sustained the Vieira family crumbled. Laura took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, she felt air enter her lungs without guilt. There was no victory in what she had done, only truth. And sometimes, the truth hurts more than the injustice itself. Eduardo watched her with the gaze of a man who had lost everything, but perhaps at that moment was recovering something that money could never buy: his conscience. "Forgive me," he murmured in a whisper. Laura looked away to the window. Outside, the sky was beginning to open and a beam of light filtered through the glass, illuminating her face. "Some things can't be fixed with words, Dad," she said softly. "But the truth, it always finds its way." That sentence hung in the air, like an echo that would carry through the years. When she left the room, the construction worker sounded different. The sound of her footsteps was no longer that of a wounded woman, but of someone who had survived her own destruction. The scandal would spread, yes. There would be headlines, rumors, trials. But none of that mattered. For the first time, Laura could look at herself in the mirror without fear. And as I walked through the company gate, the wind blew again. This time, light, almost liberating. The same wind that had long ago carried shame now seemed to herald a new beginning. The days following the confrontation were deafeningly silent. The Vieira home, once filled with formal dinners and rehearsed laughter, now breathed emptiness. The wide hallways echoed with memories, and every painting on the walls seemed to leer with disapproval. Perfection had shattered, and in its place were fragments of a family that had learned, the hard way, the weight of its own choices. Patricia had disappeared without a trace. They said she had traveled abroad, trying to escape the scandals that spread with the cruel speed of social media. Her name circulated among newspapers and malicious comments. But Laura avoided reading any news. There was no longer anger, only exhaustion. She had fought enough. Now what she sought was peace. Eduardo remained secluded in the office of his old house, surrounded by papers and memories. The man who once commanded meetings with a firm voice now spent hours in front of the window, gazing at the garden, as if searching for a trace of what he had lost. The pride that had sustained him for so many years had become his punishment. No company, fortune, or influence could erase the memory of the day he doubted his own daughter. Laura, on the other hand, found strength in silence. She returned to work, no longer at the construction company, but at a small independent architecture firm. The white walls, simple furniture, and natural light streaming through the windows created a refuge. Each project she designed was a way of rebuilding not only spaces but also herself. In the mornings, she liked to walk alone along the city's waterfront. The wind on her face, the sound of waves crashing against the sand. Everything reminded her that time never stops, even when her heart insists on reliving the past. Sometimes she thought about her father. Other times she tried not to think. There were wounds that still hurt when remembered, but she understood that forgiveness isn't born of haste, but of understanding. One afternoon, as she passed the former headquarters of Constructora Vieira, she stopped for a moment. The building still bore the family name in metallic letters reflecting the sun. It was strange to realize that despite everything, a part of her was still there, in the foundations, in the memories, in the invisible marks that time cannot erase. But now she looked without pain. It no longer defined her. It was just the past, and she had finally learned to leave it where it belonged. The scandal gradually faded. The city found new stories to comment on, new downfalls to witness. And like every storm, this one dissipated too. Eduardo discreetly sold some of his shares and donated the money to social projects. No one understood the gesture, but he knew why. It was his silent way of trying to restore balance to what he had destroyed. A year passed. One Saturday morning, Laura went to visit her old house. The gate still creaked, the garden was covered in dry leaves, but the place seemed less cold. Eduardo was waiting for her, sitting on the terrace, his eyes weary but serene. She watched him from a distance, and for a moment she considered leaving. But something inside her, perhaps the part that still believed in new beginnings, made her stay. There were no words, no promises. Just a simple gesture, a slight nod, a look that said what no apology could convey. In that instant, something broke. Not the resentment, but the silence. It was a beginning. Small, timid, but real. The following months were spent in cautious interactions. Eduardo began frequenting his daughter's small office, discreetly helping with contacts and recommendations. They didn't talk about the past. Both knew that time would heal what words couldn't. Laura accepted his presence naturally. She had learned that forgiving isn't forgetting, but freeing oneself from the need to relive the pain. Over time, life resumed its rhythm. Laura opened a new branch in another city and became recognized for her talent and integrity. She became a symbol of quiet resilience, someone who faced the world's judgment and still chose to walk with her head held high. In her interviews, she rarely spoke about herself. She preferred to mention her projects, her teams, and the value of trust. But sometimes, when a reporter pressed her for her story, she would smile and simply say, "Some truths take time to blossom, but when they do, they illuminate even the most barren soil." And that was it. No revenge, no glory, just the certainty that life has its own ways of dispensing justice, and often it happens silently. One sunny afternoon, Laura sat alone on a park bench, watching children play. One of them, dark-haired and smiling broadly, ran up to her and handed her a fallen flower. Laura thanked him, deeply moved. Looking up at the sky, she felt something inside her calm. It was as if, finally, the past had found its place, and love, once so unfairly confused, had been purified by time. The breeze blew lightly, and she closed her eyes. Nothing weighed her down anymore.